Welcome, everyone. This is the Buttercup Podcast, where we talk about early childhood topics. Today, my guest is Miss Celeste Headlee. She is a globally recognized journalist and expert in conversation and communication. She's a regular guest on NPR and American Public Radio and co-host of the new series Retro Report on PBS. Celeste's TED Talk she shared 10 ways to have a better conversation. I love your TED Talk. I've watched it many times, and it's had over 23 million total views to date, and she serves as an advisory board member for procon.org and the Listen First Project. She received the 2019 Media Changemaker Award. Award-winning book she just wrote not long ago is We Need to Talk, How to Have Conversations That Matter. She also just released in March, right?
In March.
Just this year, Do Nothing, How to Break Away from Overworking, Overdoing, and Underliving. A timely, actionable, and illuminating manifesto, Do Nothing reveals that despite our constant search for new ways to hack our bodies and minds for peak performance, human beings are working more, not less, living harder, not smarter, and becoming more lonely and anxious. Thank you, Celeste, for joining me today. I'm so excited to talk to you.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you for taking the time. And what drew me to your book, I first started reading your book about We Need to Talk recently, about a year ago. A couple of students, grad students of mine, we were doing a project on electronic communication with parents of young children. And then I came across your book, We Need to Talk. And then I saw your TED Talk and I was like, oh my gosh, I want to buy this book for every single student of mine who's graduating, because it's such a great book. We all need to talk. So do you want to talk a little bit about where your interest in communication comes from?
It all stemmed from trying to become a better journalist. I got my first job as a full-time radio host in 2009, and I just was trying to learn better interviewing strategies. And as you know from this podcast, interviewing is just a formal version of a conversation. So I consulted as many of the books I could find on how to have better conversations. And frankly, they weren't great. The research and evidence wasn't there to back up the advice they were giving. And when I tried that advice out, I'm talking about the advice like maintain eye contact and nod your head and repeat back what you just heard. Every time I tested it in the studio, it didn't work. So I kind of had to start from scratch. And that started all of the research in communication, was seeking out those studies myself and trying to see what do we actually know about human conversation, what works and what doesn't.
Yes. One of my all-time favorite TV shows is Frasier, and Kelsey Grammer plays mental health provider, and he has a talk show, and his famous line at the beginning of every call is, "I'm Frasier Crane and I'm listening." Yes, I love that part. And talk about listening, because that's one of the 10 tips that you give in your TED Talk about the importance of listening, but also how to listen better.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a common assumption that people don't listen well because of their electronics, because of their technology. But the fact of the matter is that human beings don't listen very well. We're not great at it. We're very good at talking. We really enjoy talking, especially when we're talking about ourselves and the things that we like or don't like. In fact, doing that, Harvard discovered in a fairly recent study that talking about yourself and your likes and dislikes activates your dopamine center, the same center as sex and heroin. So it's very pleasurable. But listening is hard. And the fact of the matter is that what we generally associate with a good conversationalist, we think that involves somebody who tells good stories and is entertaining and engaging, but that's just a good talker. In order to be a good conversationalist, your listening skills have to be as good as your talking skills are. And it's just hard for us. It's hard for our species to focus on what someone else is saying. And we're so bad at focusing on it that immediately after hearing someone talk, we only remember 50% of what they said. And that's research that goes back to the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. So that's well before the smartphone ever got involved, which is all just to say that listening is going to be difficult. It's going to be hard for you, and you have to practice it.
Yes. One of the things I love about both your books is how you weave in research, and it reminds me of Malcolm Gladwell's writing, and how he really does an examination of a topic and goes into the literature and the research that's been done on the topic. And it's such a pleasure to read your writing, and the things in We Need to Talk really emphasize the research that's been done on listening. And how has your interest in opera informed your listening? You want to talk a little bit about your background?
Yeah, I mean, both of my degrees are in vocal performance, which is opera. The thing is that musicians are one of the very few professions that are trained how to listen. You go to school and there's all kinds of public speaking classes. It's really rare to find a class in listening, even though that's much harder for us. So, I spent all of my training in school learning how to listen better. And I don't think I realized how valuable that experience was. When you're listening in music, you're not listening horizontally. You're not just listening to a melody line. If you're going to actually be in tune and be in rhythm and all those other things, you have to be listening vertically. You have to be listening all the way down through an orchestra or through a chorus or whatever it may be. Or vertically, even if you're just listening to a piano, you're listening vertically all the way down, not just the right hand, but the left hand as well. And that's a different kind of listening than most of us do. And it's incredibly good experience. And I like to think that in some ways our listening skills are like a muscle, and you just have to keep exercising them.
Yes. There's a famous study called the 3-minute interview in health communication. And one of the things that they found is if a medical professional interrupts the patient within the first 3 minutes, that patient is less likely to go on to give pertinent information that can lead to an accurate diagnosis or treatment. And listening is so important and has so much impact on our lives, and it could be life or death. I have a brother who's in the aviation field, and I went and sat in on a class once, cockpit resource management, and it was so interesting. They were talking about a plane crash in Kuala Lumpur, and it was because 2 American pilots were talking in the cockpit, and they were using language that wasn't textbook English, and the person that was communicating with them misunderstood, and they hit a mountain, and so many people were impacted by that accident. And I think what you talk about in We Need to Talk and in your work about the importance of listening is so critical to effective communication.
And coincidentally, I start the book with a plane crash that was most likely caused by miscommunication in the cockpit. It's a very famous plane crash that happened not far outside DC, and it was caused because the pilot wasn't listening to his co-pilot. So yeah, sometimes it's life or death. And even in the introduction of the book, I then go into hospitals, because the vast majority of mistakes in hospitals are made as a result of miscommunication. Not just miscommunication between a medical professional and the patient, but miscommunication between the medical professionals, between the nurse and the doctor, between the nurse who did the overnight shift and the nurse who takes over in the morning. We don't listen to one another. And the research shows also that the smarter you are, the worse your conversational skills are likely to be. And that's for a number of reasons. Number one, we know that just human beings tend to not listen to people that we unconsciously decide are of lower rank than we are. Either they are lower rank in their professional life or they're not as smart as we are. If we determine them to be lower rank, we don't listen to them. That's number one. Number two, a very smart person often assumes they know what they're about to hear. So they hear about the first few words of something that someone's saying. They, again, often unconsciously say, oh, I know where this is going. And they either interrupt at that point or they stop listening and they're just waiting to say what it is that they're going to say in response. And one of the final reasons is that when you're very, very smart, you know a lot of stuff. And so you're often very interested or focused on what you're going to say, how you're going to educate someone else or enlighten someone else or share with them this interesting information. And you don't focus on what it is that you may learn from the other person. So yeah, it's especially bad with someone who is a pilot or a doctor or anybody who is smart and their rank comes from their intelligence, right? Professors are the same way. They often struggle to listen to not just their students, but their teaching assistants. Administrators don't often listen to the teachers. It just goes on and on and on that we're not listening to one another. And this becomes so crucial, especially as our world continues diversifying. Our world is a racist world. It's a sexist world. And so people are already set up to not listen as well to women as they do to men. People are already set up through unconscious bias to not listen as well to someone of color as they are to someone who's white. So we really have to start becoming aware of the fact that we shut people out, that we stop listening. And rather than try to work on your unconscious biases, because that's very, very difficult. Instead, just start training yourself in how to turn your listening back on. Notice, be aware of when you've stopped listening to someone, and then flip that switch back on.
I like that idea too about training yourself, that it's a skill and it's something you can teach yourself. It's something you can start at a baseline and get better at. And especially when we're working with families and young children, we can always improve. There's always room for improvement. How has being a mom informed your communication skills?
It's interesting. I included a lot of stories about my son in the book about he was not all that thrilled about. Um, but I'm glad that we're talking about young people here because some of the category of people that we so rarely really listen to are children. And I was the same way as a mom, that of course your whole job as a parent is to educate your kids, train your kids, guide your kids, right? And not only that, but your kid sometimes better than they know themselves as they're growing, right? You saw them when they were born and they were toddlers and they don't remember that anymore. So you have been a longer history of what they're like. And you get into this habit of knowing what they're saying. And I stopped listening at a certain point. And I try to be very honest about those things in the book, because I don't want anyone to think that I'm saying, I'm so great at this, I'm going to come down from my perch on the mountain and explain to you how to do this right. No, it's hard. It's hard for me. It's hard for everybody. And being a mother really points up, once you start becoming aware of your brain turning off listening, you suddenly realize it's happening all the time, that you stop listening all the time, sometimes by necessity, because I would be like, if you say one more word, my brain will explode. But sometimes it's not necessary. Sometimes you can listen better.
Yes. What is System 1?
System 1 thinking, that comes from Daniel Kahneman's work. And System 1 thinking is your gut instinct, basically. He separates our thinking into System 1, which usually is your amygdala. So the amygdala is the very oldest evolutionary part of your brain. It's what people would think of as the monkey brain, right? It sits right at the top of your spine. It is based on fear, and it makes gut decisions. That's extremely necessary right? If you had to really think through every time you were deciding between non-fat milk and 2%, if every decision that you made, how to open the door, had to be thought through, you'd never make it through life. So we need our system one thinking. The problem is that we use system one thinking, which is basically making decisions without really thinking, right? That the decision was unconscious. We use that even in every circumstance, even circumstances that require system two thinking. System two thinking involves your prefrontal cortex, which is where the executive thinking is made. It's where you have a second thought and maybe even a third thought before deciding something. And that's where your more mature and careful decisions are made. So a lot of times the decisions that we make that require that system to a little bit more careful thought, we're just doing those based on gut instinct. And that's how very, very racist decisions are made. It's where sexist decisions is made. It's usually the source of a lot of our bad decisions. It's because we're using system one and we really need to be using system two.
Another thing you talk about in your books is wool gathering.
Yeah, wool gathering. So there's two ways in which, okay, so first of all, your brain is on all the time, right? Like if somebody's ever told you, you know, clear your mind, that's BS. You cannot clear your mind. Even while you're sleeping, your mind is. So there's two ways in which your very active brain gets in the way of conversation. One is while you're talking, right? So this is not wool gathering. This is like your shaggy dog story. This is while you're talking and you're saying, oh, you know, we're going to South Africa next year. And you're like, oh, I think we're going to go in March. You know what, we might go in July because, you know, we've got to get the car done. Oh, you know what? Also, we've got our how, blah, 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 you know, and that's when you're doing the shaggy dog story. But the wool gathering is when you're trying to listen. And in your brain is constantly going, right? And it's thinking up details and it's bringing up memories. All your brain is trying to do is dredge up through the archives relevant information that might help you better understand what you're hearing. But sometimes we get caught up in those thoughts and it pulls us away from what we're supposed to be listening to, and we get caught up in all of this stuff going on, and then you're not listening anymore. I mean, the term wool gathering is because if you have a herd of sheep, flock of sheep, as they're going through the brush, they leave little bits of their wool on the bushes and trees and things, and then the shepherd goes around and they go from place to place and they gather up all the little tufts of wool so that nothing is left behind. That's kind of what your brain is doing. It's just going, oh, and I remember though, they mentioned 2012. What was it? And you get caught up in all those thoughts and you realize you have no idea what they just said for the past 2 minutes.
Yes. I've been in meetings like that. I don't know who said this, but there's a quote, a committee meeting is a group of people who sit around for hours and take minutes. And so many times I'm thinking, how can I contribute and be an effective participant in this situation? One of the things that you talk about in your books and you share is how multitasking is such a detriment to effective communication. And I think that's what we do a lot of times in meetings, and especially now on Zoom with the pandemic and having a lot of meetings happen virtually. I know myself, I've noticed where I'll have a Zoom meeting going and then I'll have like 5 tabs open and then my email will ding and it's like, oh, I've got to get control over this. I can only focus on one thing at a time. And so just closing all those little tabs and trying to stay on topic and stay focused. Do you want to talk a little bit about multitasking and what you've learned?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest revelation to some people is that you can't multitask. A lot of people tell themselves that they do, and then there's this whole myth that women are better multitaskers than men. Nope, women can't multitask. Men can't multitask. There is one scientific wrinkle to all that, which is that human beings suck at multitasking. We're terrible at it. And in fact, over time, that's some of the most distressing information, is that over time, it can cause cognitive damage when you try to multitask every day. But women suck at it a tiny bit less than men. That's where that myth comes from. When they did that testing, by the way, they were talking about multitasking that involved like solving a color puzzle, like what color is this, while they were walking on a treadmill. That's the extent of the difficult multitasking we're doing. Once you get even any more sophisticated than that, answering email while you're on a Zoom call, it's out the window. You can't do it. And it's a huge strain on your mind to try to do it. So not only should we not multitask because you can't, but this idea that you, not only that you can, but that the exploration I did in the second book, Do Nothing, was on this societal pressure that you must multitask, that there's so much to do that if you're not trying to do two things at once, you're wasting time, you're losing time, you're going to fall behind. So it becomes this pressure to where we feel guilty if we're just doing one thing at a time. Like right now on my screen, the only thing there is this Zoom call. That's it. And that's even now difficult because my brain is wandering off in different directions, even with just this one task for me to do.
And it's almost lunchtime.
Exactly. It's Rosh Hashanah. I have a brisket in the oven. So when it comes to multitasking, the delusion that needs to be broken is this idea, A, that we can do it, or B, that it helps us get things done faster. In fact, it leads to more errors. It's going to waste your time. The cognitive damage that I mentioned earlier is nothing to be sniffed at. And in truth, if you can get yourself to focus on one thing at a time, you will get things done so much faster and more efficiently, and fewer errors in them. So in the end, you're actually saving time by focusing on one thing at a time. Now, this is especially true of conversation. Conversation is a very cognitively demanding task. When you look at a brain that is actually conversing with another human brain, it's all lit up. It's demanding. It requires...
So sorry.
It's because I'm tight. It requires a lot of higher thinking and problem solving, because not only am I trying to be articulate myself, but I'm sitting here and trying to imagine where you're coming from. We're imagining what's going on in somebody else's mind. And some people think this is the thing that distinguishes the human species from other species, right? This theory that we can imagine someone else's thought processes. It's hard. That's the bottom line. Having a conversation is hard, and it requires your full attention.
It requires your full attention. Multitasking is
it's a scourge.
Discouraged. One of the things I love about your book, Do Nothing, is the idea that you're not saying don't do anything and just be lazy and sit on the couch and eat bonbons all day. What you're saying is, in that book, how to get the most out of life. That's what I took out of it anyway. And in Italian, there's a phrase called dolce far niente, which means the sweetness of doing nothing. And I think in our world today, you know, a lot of us are still at home, we're in quarantine, we have our day planned out, and we have so many electronics in our lives. We're on the computer, we're on iPads, we're on iPhones. And I mean, there's just so much digital interference in our life. And one of the things that I've been trying to do after reading your book, Do Nothing, is on the weekends to try to do a digital detox and not have any electronics. What are some tips you have for getting the most out of life and communicating better? And
that is a big question. So I'm going to focus it just on pandemic living. It's interesting. Somebody said that we're not working from home. We're now living at work. So one of the most important things, I mean, a digital detox is fantastic. And the number one easiest thing for people to do is find at least 10 to 15 minutes a day when you're away from electronics, where you're smartphone is not in your sight line, it's not making noise, just get away. Take a walk without your smartphone. You'll survive. We've only had smartphones since 2007. You can make it. So that's number one. But in terms of the fact that we're living at work now, you have to be super careful that you don't allow work to claim your whole house. You know, there's when someone is having sleep troubles, one of the first piece of advice that a sleep doctor will give you is to do nothing in your bed but sleep, right? You don't want to train your brain that the bed is a place for anything but sleeping. You want your brain to know that when you crawl into that bed, it's time to go to sleep. It is the same thing with working in your house. If you grab your laptop and you work from anywhere in your whole house and go out to your porch and blah, 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 you're basically training your brain that every bit of your house is for work. And eventually you will get to this point where your brain doesn't ever actually relax. It thinks it's working all the time. It is in a frame of mind that it would be when you step into your office or your workspace normally. So you can't allow that to happen. You can't let work claim your entire living area. You have to choose the place where you go. I don't care if it's a 2-foot square section of your table, kitchen table. I don't care how small it is. That is where you work. That's where you take work calls. That's where you work on your laptop. And as soon as you leave that place, you're not working anymore. And if you decide to check your work email, you do it in that spot, because you need to keep the amount of area that's that your brain thinks of as work as small as possible, so that when you walk away, you can actually experience some kind of relaxation and leisure.
That's great. Thank you, Celeste. Do you have any advice for students who are uh, um, getting ready to graduate and go on to post-school outcomes, whether it be jobs or graduate school?
The first thing I'd say is that, okay, so here's my advice. You're probably not an introvert. Introverts are rare. The vast majority of people in the world are not introverts. It's become really fashionable to think you're an introvert, and that becomes a vicious cycle. The reason I say this is because young people are more likely than any other generation to avoid authentic human connection. Means a human connection where you can hear a human voice. But that connection, that kind of contact, hearing another human voice, is super good for you. It's good for you neurologically, cognitively, emotionally, even physiologically. It brings down your cortisol levels. It lowers your heart rate. It lowers your stress. It's good for you in a huge number of ways. So we have this younger generation that's avoiding that contact. And part of it is because they think they're introverted. You're probably not. Most people in the world are ambiverts, meaning that sometimes they need time among others and sometimes they need time alone, but they're adaptable. They can change. If they're forced to go to a work picnic, they can stand there and talk to other people. That's what an ambivert is. They're the healthiest, they're the most adaptable. That's what most people are. The reason it's so dangerous to think that you're an introvert is when you believe that, it means that you avoid contact with others, which means that your skills in terms of your communication and social skills begin to deteriorate, which means that when you do come in contact with others, it's less likely to go well, which then reinforces your idea that you're an introvert. And it becomes this cycle. And this is horrible because loneliness will kill you. And I'm not speaking rhetorically. Loneliness literally degrades your internal organs. It's as bad for you as morbid obesity and smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. The human species is evolved to take health, not just take benefit from contact with other people. We need it. The feeling of belonging is the number one innate need that humans have after we've taken care of survival, after we have food, water, and shelter. And so loneliness will eventually bring about premature death. I literally, I can't say it any more strongly than that. So anything that you can do to relieve the loneliness that sometimes communicates itself as stress or being overwhelmed, anything you can do is going to help you out. And the very last thing I'll say about this is that it doesn't have to be some 2-hour conversation with a close friend. One thing that we know through research is what's called the power of weak ties. Those small conversations you have with the barista who's making your coffee, that it's a good day, the wave that you get from somebody on the street. The great Nicholas Epley in Chicago said, nobody waves, but almost everybody waves back. Those little interactions increase your feeling of belonging, and that's sometimes all that you need.
Well, you have such an amazing career, and I think people who are graduating today, they look at people like you and they see your career path, and hearing that, you know, you're not alone, and to protect your connections and relationships with others. The strength of weak ties is so valuable and so important. Is there a way listeners can follow you, Celeste?
Yeah, it's hard to avoid me sometimes. I mean, my website is just celesteheadlee.com, and pretty much any social media channel, my handle is just Celeste Headlee. As far as I know, I'm the only Celeste Headlee in the world, but that's where I am on Twitter. It's where I am on Instagram, and I do take social media breaks on a pretty regular basis. But you know, I like to rant, so I post a lot.
I love your Twitter. The picture of you on Twitter is awesome.
Yeah,
I follow you on Twitter, and I love reading what you post because it's never like the same twice. I mean, it's so dynamic about what's happening today, and different things. That there's been times where I'll read what you write, and I'm learning about the news as it's happening. So thank you for your journalism and communication.
I appreciate that. Thanks.
Thank you, Celeste Headlee. And check out her 2 books, because we can all improve our communication, and we can all do nothing and have a better life and turn off our electronics every now and then. Thank you, Celeste.
My pleasure. Thank you.